Hey y'all. So mea culpa. I screwed up. I did not apparently realize that there exists a very comprehensive style guide for Python. So I was kind of using some random BS that I've picked up over the years, and that is what I get for being a self-taught programmer in a lot of ways. And not having learned Python in school, having learned it on my own. Um, so my apologies. I am going to briefly go over the PEP8 style guide. This is going to appear both at the beginning of the course and again in the middle of the course. I'm not going to require you to use the PEP8 style guide for the first half of the course, um, basically because it requires that you know a little bit about code. Like you need to know some words and stuff before you can start applying all of the conventions. Um, After the middle of the course, I'm going to try to encourage you to use the PEP8 style guide. That said, I'm not going to be a real super stickler for getting all of the exactly everything right out of the style guide. But I would encourage you to use this thing. It really is a nice, consistent source for making sure that code is readable and usable and that naming conventions are consistent. And frankly, I wish I had known that this thing existed earlier because it, I think, would improve things in some ways. So I'm going to provide two links to places where you can read about the PEP8 guide. Um, One is just the PEP8 style guide itself. You can see that there is a huge amount of stuff in here. Most of these are things that we've already been doing anyways, which is why I don't feel too bad about letting you run wild up till now. The naming conventions are a little bit different than what I have traditionally used, so that's what I'm going to focus on here. I'm also going to teach you how to get this into a linter in VS Code so that you can see some of, so that you can get these errors thrown at you. The one thing I'm going to highlight in here is there is this thing about maximum line width that says that lines should be limited to a maximum of 79 characters. And I personally find this requirement to be the only one that's really like flat obnoxious in here. This comes from a day and an age when lots of coders were reading code on Unix terminals, and there's some line considerations there. Um, it is good practice to keep your line, to keep your character count in your lines down somewhat, but 79 characters is a bit tight. I tend to think that 120 is probably a more reasonable thing. Really, what you want is to be able to have kind of dueling pieces of code on a single screen, which is nice. But frankly, a lot of us use multi-monitor displays these days, and IDEs are much better about wrapping. So I think this one is a little bit ridiculous. I tend to set my linters to ignore, or I'm going to set my linter to ignore this one. But the naming conventions are a good idea. Spaces are a good idea. If you scroll through this thing, there's a whole long list of stuff about where parentheses should go. There are some nice comments on comments in here that are a good idea. Mostly, I'm going to let you read through this thing. This would be one source that you can look at. The other source is this nice real Python, how to write beautiful Python code. And this is where the naming conventions are a little bit more clear here. So these are the things that I'm going to be most concerned with, is just this naming convention scheme is, I think, actually quite a bit better than what I usually use. So if you're watching this at the beginning of the semester, you'll note that I don't adhere to these through some of the videos, and that is foolish on my part. I encourage you to do better than I am doing. You'll see that I'll update some of the repels to reflect what the better naming conventions would be, but I'm not going to re-record hundreds of videos for this. I probably should, but human time is somewhat valuable, I guess. I don't know. Maybe my time's not. I don't know. Okay, so let me show you how to get a linter going. So in VS Code here, and I have just a little example piece of code up that calculates shingle widths or something. So, oh, okay, so it's popping that up. If it doesn't pop that up, hit Control Shift and P, and then you want to go find Python select linter. Yours won't have this recently used, right? It'll be way down here. You can type, right? Oops, that's not how you spell Python. So Python, scroll down until you find select linter, which mine's up here, but yours will be in that list. Okay, and then you want flake8, and then it's going to tell you, hang on. Okay, so I had some issues. If you're having trouble saving because of a dirty user settings file, you can open it. This is roughly the file path here. Just save it, and then you'll need to install. Okay, so should be good to go now, hopefully. Let me see. All right, so now to try, Control Shift P, flake8. Ah, there we go. Okay, so now I have a whole bunch of flake8 errors. Okay, so block comment should have a space after this. That seems like a good idea. Okay, so that should have a space. That seems like a good idea. Let's just go through these. Indentation level is not a multiple of 4. Okay, so that's a settings problem. So that's my settings, and where is that one? Okay, so I'm just double checking that under my, sorry, hang on. Okay, so in my settings, I'm concerned that when I hit tab, I'm only getting 2 spaces and I should be getting 4. So I'm just gonna look in here, under suggestions here, text editor, there is a, oops, where'd it go? Tab size, spaces is 4. So this piece of code was copy and pasted out of Repel, which apparently uses 2 spaces, which is not. Oops. Okay, so I'm just adding the 2 required spaces here. Okay, so let's relint this. Okay, now I still have 1, and it says no new line at end of file. So that's just maybe one trailing new line that it wants at the bottom there. Okay, cool. So now I've got this thing debugging with respect to flake8 now, and the part of the problem here is that it's going to debug the technical parts of flake8, but it's not debugging the naming conventions. So it'll do a good job with tabs and spaces and line widths and all that crap, but it's not going to do the naming conventions. So that's why I was kind of trying to highlight naming conventions earlier. So if I go look at my naming conventions, I'm like, okay, so functions should be named with lower cases and separated with underscores. Okay, well, in my particular piece of code, I have no functions. Okay. Variables should be either lowercase words or single letters. And there's some letters you should avoid. You shouldn't name things with shit that looks like 1s and 0s. So no L's, no I's. Well, no capital I's at least. That's just good coding practice. Avoid O's and zeros as variable names. It seems very silly to even have to say that. Um, but like you'll notice that the convention in PEP8 is that you separate words with underscores, and I have a habit of doing what's called camelback notation, which is that I capitalize the first words. And you'll notice that's what they do with classes, but that's not what they suggest with variables. And that's fine. That's a good suggestion, actually, since classes should have capitalized names anyways to separate them from variables. So, okay, so I should really be putting underscores in here. And that seems reasonable. And then there's this thing about classes and methods. Okay, those seem legit. I don't have any of those in this program, but those seem like things I could follow. And then this is the one that maybe is actually something that's different than what I've been doing. I haven't been highlighting the difference between constants and variables at all because, I don't know, well, frankly, because I have a tendency to write code in a go. And so oftentimes when I define a variable at the beginning, I don't know whether it's going to be constant throughout. That is foolish on my part. I really should differentiate. So constants are variables that you don't intend should change throughout the program. And so I do have some constants. The starting value, and this is a terrible naming convention, the starting value, call it inch. It's horrible, Joe. Why would you do that? Let's get a better naming convention. So that's going to be, I'm going to call that start underscore inch. And then I'm going to call this start underscore eighths. Oops. And that should all be capitalized. Eighths. Okay, and so now I need to go find where I had those. So that was inch. Oh. Okay, so I'm noticing as I'm parsing my code that start inch was not actually, like, that wasn't something I was going to have be constant. So let me undo those changes. So this comment misled me, right? So this comment should have said something like inch and eighth variables for lines. So this is one, you have to know a little bit what this piece of code is doing. So this piece of code is just marking where I draw lines on the roof to put shingles on. So these are the inch and eighths variables for those lines, and they're initialized at a starting value. So their inch starts at 2 and eighths start at 0. So I'm starting 2 inches up the roof or something. And then the shingle reveal, that's a constant. So that's never changing throughout the program. It's just always constant. So I'm going to recapitalize this one as step inch and step eighths. And then the stopping value is also going to be constant. And then I need to go and make sure that I change those in here. So that's stop. And this one should be step inch. And this one should be step eighths. And then, okay, so you'll note this is not particularly well commented code. Does the work is not a great comment. So let me change that to reflect what it actually does. So this output where each line goes increasing by the reveal at each step. So This is going to loop through. It's going to start at 2 and 0, right? And then it's going to add the shingle reveal. So it's going to be to 8, 8 and 5/8 is the reveal. Pretty sure I didn't actually use 8 and 5/8 shingles, but whatever, it doesn't matter. So it adds this reveal, and then if appropriate, it carries, right? So if the eighths are bigger than 8, and then it prints out the values. So if I hit go, I see that my first line should be at 10 and 5/8, and then the next line should be at 19 and 2/8, and 27 and 7, and so forth. And I'm not seeing any linter problems. And I think I've actually got everything according to my PEP8 naming conventions. So there's kind of two things here, right? There's the like technical linter conventions, that's spacing and tabs and stuff. And then there's also the naming conventions. The other thing it's not going to do is check my comments really thoroughly. It'll check the things that are easy to check. I encourage you to read all the way through the PEP8 guide. It really is a good piece of advice. This thing about line width is a little bit frustrating, but to be honest, you're probably not running into 80 wide lines anyways. And really your code is much more readable anyhow if it's not. Like, if you have one or two really long lines, then most of what you're looking at is white space, which kind of is frustrating. If you want to read a whole bunch of what random people think about this, I encourage you to read this Reddit thread that I'm going to link about what people think about the PEP8's recommended line length. You will find a bunch of opinions that roughly mirror my own in here, but the top voted comment, of course, just says suck it up and do it, which is probably also decent advice. So perhaps suck it up and just do it is a reasonable thing. I find the gymnastics they go through to get around this a bit much for me. I think it's probably better to just let it go to 120 lines and deal, or 120 characters and deal with it there. But yeah, whatever, basically. The naming conventions are really quite good though, and so I would encourage you to follow those. If you are doing this in the first half of the course and you want to follow those naming conventions, I will definitely be impressed if you manage PEP8 conventions before the midterm. After the midterm, they'll be more more required than suggested, but before the midterm, they're only suggested. So enjoy. Thank you for putting up with this, and do feel free to tease me about being silly with this. This really was a kind of deep philosophical issue that I went through here. So yeah, I kind of deserve a little ribbing on it.